All right, thank you very much. My name is Denis Davydov. I'm coming from the University of Vaasa, which is in Finland, actually. And yeah, so this is kind of related stuff to what John was talking during the keynote speech. And but this is kind of a little bit other side. I don't really look about the foreign banks, but I'm looking at the state-owned banks. So I'm wondering about the state ownership of banks, not really the foreign banks. So the title is "Does State Ownership of Bank Matter?" And I'm using the Russian data to test this question. And yeah, so basically, what do we actually know about the state ownership? Well, I'm sure that John knows most of the stuff about the state ownership, but basically at this stage, the theory that we have about the ownership in general of the financial institutions suggests that state ownership of commercial enterprises is damaging because of the, well, multiple reasons. So I'll list all of them, I'm not going to go through them. So there is a political interference, managerial incentives, and so on and so forth. So monitoring issues and so on and so forth. So empirical literature is pretty much supports the theory, and many papers find that state ownership is inefficient, less profitable, more risky, negatively affects overall financial development, and so on and so forth. So overall, it seems like ownership, first of all, ownership is an important factor in many kind of outcome variables, like those ones. And then usually, or let's say in general, it seems like state participation in the ownership stake is less likely to be associated with the efficiency or profitability or stability or growth. So there is some evidence on the state ownership of banks. So usually people argue that government banks perform poorly. State-owned banks charge systemically lower interest rates. So this is another kind of evidence. I'm not going to go through all of the literature that we have here. But yeah, so in general, the empirical literature on the state ownership of banks is really kind of negative and skeptical about the thing. So before the crisis of 2008, theory suggested to bring the state ownership of banks pretty much to zero, right? So empirics really favor the privatization. John has at least 2 papers on privatization that I'm citing in the paper. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you really recommend that privatization is a good thing, right? So there is an observed active transfer of state ownership rights to the market and the private investors in the developing economies, and at the same time, emerging countries were actively developing the privatization programs. For Russia, for example, was planning, I'm not sure if it's anymore, but was planning to sell all state holdings in firms outside of the defense and energy industries by 2016. So this thing I found actually in the Financial Times, and it was taken from the Medvedev's words on some occasion. I don't remember which one. So yeah, but at least back in these times, they were planning to sell pretty much all holdings outside of the 2 major industries. Probably not going to happen. But yet, after the financial crisis, we can see that things really didn't go that way. So it went actually other way around. So since 2008, instead of massive privatization as suggested by the theory and empirics, both developed and emerging countries experienced large-scale nationalizations and bailouts of the private banks, right? So among the others, you have a long list of examples, but for example, in Great Britain, there were Northern Rock, Royal Bank of Scotland, and so on and so forth. So if you go to the, let's say, Netherlands, there was the ABN AMRO bank, which got, well, all of these banks pretty much were fully or partially nationalized. Well, this doesn't really support the existing theory and empirical evidence. So I found this funny picture on the internet. I thought I would put it on the slide. So it seems like banks really, when they're in trouble, they really kind of looking forward to the state support, and then when they get it, then they claim, okay, that was because we're so important, we're so good, So we learn from our experience. We grow from our experience in a sense. So that was kind of also part of motivation for the paper. So after the crisis, we started to notice that there are the story of the empirical research a little bit changing, right? So there was these guys, for example, they found that the state-owned banks increased lending during the crisis of 2008, and then they used the sample of 764 banks from 50 different countries. Okay, so there's a massive, extensive data set that they used, and they were still able to argue about that. Then other guys from the Bank of Finland actually, they found that credit supply in Russia diminished, but the reduction was lower for the state-owned banks and higher for the foreign banks. And there's a couple of other papers that pretty much find the same picture. So it seems like now state-owned banks is a good thing, right? So the question kind of still remains, the state ownership of banks, is it really good or evil? So this is kind of seems a little bit unclear. So it seems to be evil in normal, non-crisis times, but it seems to be rather good during the crisis. All right, so the purpose of this paper is exactly to examine the ethics of the state ownership of banks on lending behavior and capitalization, specifically around the crisis of 2008-2010. All right, so I'm using the Russian data as I mentioned before. I have, usually when I present this paper, first question that I get is why Russia? So I try to come up with a good answers. I'm not sure if they're good enough, but those are my answers, at least to this question. So Russian banking sector is a highly state-influenced. So it's a appropriate environment to examine this hypothesis or this question. And then there is detail within. Usually, if you go to the cross-country analysis, then you might have lots of endogeneity issues and so on and so forth. So I'm using the one-country analysis, so it's supposed to be a little bit better from that from the econometric point of view. And then privatization is actually a huge ongoing concern in Russia since beginning of 2000, well, even earlier than that. So I have a sample of 348 large banks. So I limit my sample on purpose. So I don't want to look on the small private banks that are existing only in the specific regions. So I limit my sample to only large banks for the period of for this period, and based on the amount of assets that these banks hold, I'm basically looking at 90% of all banking assets in Russia. So I probably could argue that my sample is quite representative in that terms. Okay, so this is just a really brief characteristics of the Russian banking sector. I'm sure that most of you already kind of, or even know better what's happening in the Russian banking sector here than I do. But just a few things to notice is that state-owned banks variable here, and this is actually based on the Central Bank of Russia classification, not my own, but this is just the statistics from the Central Bank of Russia. So state-owned banks, there were 32 of them in 2005 and only 26 in 2011. But when you look at the percentage of total assets that these banks account for, you can see that these 32 banks hold only 40% in 2005, but in 2011, although the number of banks dropped, the amount of assets that they hold increased, well, roughly by 10%. Okay, and the same story on the equity side. Yeah, so I think I'm not going to really go into details on this one. So empirical setup that I'm having here, I'm looking basically at three things. So first, I'm looking at the credit growth, similar to John's paper. Next, I'm looking at the average interest rates that the banks are charging on their loans. And then finally, I'm looking at the capitalization, so I'm using just the log of capital ratio of banks. So as for the empirical model, let me get back to this in a second. So first, about the contribution. So in contrast to many other papers or many previous papers on this topic, I'm actually using the percentage levels of the state ownership instead of just a dummy variable. So most of the papers that I was looking at, they were just using a dummy variable if the bank is state-owned or not. So I'm using the exact percentages, and I can tell you that wasn't the easiest part in the paper to calculate all the percentage, because most of you know in Russia it's actually quite tricky to understand how much exactly the government holds in the particular bank. And I literally had to manually go into the reports of the banks and check who is at the very end, who's the very end holder of the bank. So I checked it up to the third level. So the easiest example would be the Gazprom Bank. So officially Gazprom Bank has nothing to do with the government if you look at the shareholders. But when you see that there is a Gazprom as the main shareholder, and you know that the Gazprom is controlled by the government, so it's kind of really hard to say that Gazprom is not affected by the government. Gazprom Bank, I mean. Okay, so then I'm also, because I'm using these levels, it kind of allows me to account for the nonlinear relationships. So there are a couple of papers that actually found that there is a nonlinearity between the ownership variable and some other banking characteristics. And then I also test for efficiency of the government intervention, but that's going to be the last thing. So coming back to the specification model here, so I have my explanatory variable, the percentage level of the state ownership, and then I'm also using the squared variable to test for the nonlinearity. And then I'm using a bunch of control variables, which are basically the same as in the previous study. So I'm just throwing in most of the things. So I'm using also bank and the year fixed effects. So here it goes the change, the gross, the difference between log loans at time t and log loans at time tt minus 1. And here is just the interest income on loans divided by the average gross loans. Okay, so I know that this is probably not the best measure of the interest rate on loans, because I would assume that the interest rate is quite volatile in terms of the type of the loans. But this is the best actual measure that I could get from BankScope. So, and we tend to say the BankScope sucks really, but yeah, this is true. Yeah, for the capital ratio, so I have the log of capital total equity divided by total assets. So this is pretty much clear. All right. First, simple statistics. I got for the full sample period, I got nothing really significant, no significant difference between privately owned and state-owned banks. Okay, at least for the loan growth and the capital ratio. But there is pretty pronounced difference in the average interest rate on loans. So it seems like state-owned banks charge significantly lower interest rate on their loans rather than the private banks do. But those are just a simple univariate tests, okay? Yeah, then I just split the sample into the crisis years. So it seems like, again, average interest rate on loans are consistently lower for the state-owned banks rather than for the private banks. I don't find anything for the capital ratio. Seems to be the same. But when I'm looking at the loan growth, what I find is that only in 1 year out of 3 there is a statistically significant difference. All right. So I have, and the difference is actually pretty big. So you can see that for state-owned banks, the average growth of loans was 11.5% about, while for the private banks it was minus almost 5%. So the difference is pretty big. Okay, coming to the regression results. So this is not the full table. I should have put the full table like Masha did, and just to scare you up a little bit. But this is just a snapshot of the table and with the main results. So I have my main explanatory variable, the percentage level of state ownership, and here is the square term. And then I run different specification, different models with that. So first one doesn't contain the bank fixed effects. So you can see that it seems like there is a negative relationship between state ownership and the growth of loans. But at the same time, the square term has the well, although it's kind of really close to 0, but it's still positive and significant. Okay, so it seems, based on these results only, it seems like the banks with high state ownership, they actually, well, should I say, less negatively affect the credit growth. But then I include a bunch of things. So first I include just the bank fixed effects, and the results still hold. And then I'm using instead of the period fixed effects, I'm just introducing the crisis dummy. So this, instead of going year by year, I just aggregate it into one thing. And then I am using the interactions of the crisis and the state ownership variable. So you can see that the crisis actually had really, really significantly negative effect on the credit growth. But if you look at the interaction variable here, it seems like state-owned banks decreased lending by less than all the other banks. All right, and finally I'm using, let me skip this one, I'm running out of time a little bit. So finally I'm just using the crisis period itself, only the crisis period. And then I'm using the only one variable here, so only for banks which have really high state ownership. So I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was more than 90%. I used those banks. So and then you can see that there is a significant positive effect. Yeah. So if you look at the graphical representation, so here I would have the state ownership, and here I would have the loan growth rate during this period of time. So you see there is a kind of upward sloping relationship in a sense here. And so this is division by the type of the bank. So you can see that blue line over here are the private banks. So there was a huge decrease during the crisis. There was virtually zero growth in 2008, 2009, and then it was small kind of increase after that. And the red line, I have all state-owned banks. So state-owned banks, or banks that have at least, if I remember correctly, I used 25%, at least 25% of state ownership in its equity stakes. So you can still see there a huge drop here, virtually zero here, and some deviation here. But then also this green line, it's for the fully state-owned banks. So it's those banks, by fully state-owned banks, I mean the banks where the government has at least 95% of equity. And it seems like, yes, there was a drop here, but then there was quite a bit of a jump. So it's roughly, what's that, 60%? Yeah. So roughly 60% in 1 year. And then it seems to go down a little bit more and then up again. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah, let me skip this one. So let's just look at the graphs, the pictures here. So this is the same picture, but for the interest rate on loans. So there is a kind of a pattern, downward sloping pattern here for the interest rate on loans. And if you look on this representation, so again, the blue line here are the private banks. So you can see the private banks actually increase their interest rates, and then it dropped after the crisis period. And then the red line is the state-owned, all state-owned banks. There is a small increase here, but more or less it's kind of more stable here. And then the green line here are the fully state-owned banks. So those banks that have more than 95% of state ownership. So you can see here, starting from basically 2000, a little bit before 2007, there was a consistent decline in the interest rate on loans. Okay, and for the capitalization, I don't really find any statistically significant results here. Although maybe the only thing is here at the corner. So it seems like if I use, so since there is no kind of nonlinearity thing happening, so I just used the dummy variable as all the others did, and I got the positive and significant result for the crisis period only. Okay, so really quickly about the state interventions. So the Russian government placed about 700 billion rubles to 18 banks, if I remember correctly. And that wasn't like a bailout, that was more like a preferential loans in a sense. And if I remember correctly, it was 93% of the 700 billion went to the state-owned banks. 93%. So it's kind of probably okay to say that the state interventions were mostly done through the state-owned banks. And then I found actually, so this is just a dummy which takes the value of 1 for the bank that receives this support. Okay, so I found the positive effect on the loan growth, I have negative effect on the interest rates, and I have, well, kind of small evidence to suggest that there was a decrease in the capital ratio. Small one. But which makes sense actually, because since the banks during the crisis are forced to increase their lending, well, probably this lending is getting more and more riskier, and that's why it kind of leads to the decrease in the capital ratio, because they need to have more reserves for that. All right, quickly about conclusions. So the relationship between state ownership and lending behavior of banks may be nonlinear. Although the lending amounts decreased and interest rate rose, state-owned banks decreased lending and increased interest rates by less than private banks. And fully state-owned banks, so this is kind of the main part of the paper, where fully state-owned banks, in fact, enhanced lending and charged low interest rates. Okay, so state-owned banks were also better protected against the asset default by its equity during the crisis, but state interventions through the state-owned banks caused significant counter-cyclical activities, which led to the decrease in the capital ratio of these banks. Right, so I have policy implications. I'm not sure if I have time for that, and usually this is the part which people don't like the most. So I'm saying here that perhaps privatization of the state-owned banks at this stage is not such a good idea, even though that they're less efficient and less profitable and so on and so forth. It seems like state participation in the banking sector can be really, really something that stabilizes the whole sector. All right. There are several recent studies that actually saying pretty much the same thing. And then, yeah, as the final thing is probably state ownership of banks may be particularly valuable in the periods of financial stress. But then again, it's arguable. So some people might say that what is better? Is it better just to keep it private and then use the taxpayers' money during the periods of the turmoil, or then let the government have this whole thing and do the things with a little bit less fuss around the crisis? Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So the discussant is Andrei.
Так. А где это искать, Маша? Все закрыть. Что, PDF взяли, да?
Просмотр.
Просмотр-то просмотр, надо было слайды взять, не PDF на это. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I won't take too much of your time. I have only 3 substantial slides. Is this how it works? Yes. Well, to summarize, I see a double purpose of this paper. One is to research the effects of government ownership on lending behavior and capitalization of commercial banks over this period of time. And secondly, to examine the effects of government intervention, mostly through state-owned banks, on bank lending behavior and capitalization during the most recent crisis. And I have identified 3 results, namely that the banks that were, as the author suggests, fully controlled by the government significantly increased lending amounts and charged low interest rates during the crisis. The state-owned banks appeared to be better capitalized, and the government support of state-owned institutions seems to fulfill its aim and cause counter-cyclical behavior of supported banks. Well, first a couple of, maybe I stand on this side, a couple of rather technical comments. First, the coverage. Well, I've gone through this matter. I've also, like the speaker, I've gone literally through the reporting. In this case, literally perhaps stems from the word litter. So I've built my own database, and I have quite some, let's say, differences with the coverage. I think for the purposes of this type of research, bank scope and Orbis are unreliable sources. And if you want to identify the foreign-owned or foreign-controlled banks, the CBR generously provided list is useless. I think it's meaningless. For example, in table 1, Denis suggests that there are 26 state-owned banks and 108 foreign banks. I know the references to CBR data. Well, interestingly, CBR would provide the market share. I don't recall CBR really quoting in terms of numbers of institutions, but it doesn't matter. In any case, my research suggests 42 foreign state-controlled banks and 58 foreign banks. Look at this. 108 foreign banks in this coverage, and I only can identify 58. But of course, as a matter of fact, my method is much closer to what you saw this morning in Professor Bonin's presentation. Namely, we don't just look at any bank that is owned by a guy who, for some accident, owns a foreign passport. We look at the subsidiaries of the multinational banks, and I think this is enables us to focus on the impact of foreign direct investment rather than on a whole array of accidental factors. So coverage is, I don't really understand this coverage, therefore I wonder what is contained in each group. The term fully state-owned banks makes me a little puzzled. I can think of Rossельхоз Bank, of the large ones, but who else is directly fully owned by the government, I wonder. There are some banks that are fully controlled by the Deposit Insurance Corporation or by state-owned companies, perhaps. Even at the regional level, in most cases, these banks that are controlled by public sector authorities have minorities. So fully controlled banks, I don't find so many. Anyway, well, this is a little, I'm not sure, this point is not very strong. In this equation on page 13, the share of public, Denis takes the share of public ownership and takes a square term of state ownership. I wonder, what's the really point of this astronomic precision? For me, what matters is control. So for me, whether it's 51% or 52% doesn't really matter. The fact that the bank is controlled by the public sector and most of the essential decision making bears the impact of some government policies, that is what matters. Perhaps as a robustness check, you can just use a binary, or you can use a dummy, yes, no. I mean, at this level, it works. Because, for countries with relatively kind of, I would say, uncertain corporate governance, there are majority shareholders and zero shareholders. There are two types of shareholders, like Russia. Yeah? If you own 20%, means, well, you have no votes. I mean, forget it. It doesn't mean that you have 20% of the votes. You get zero votes and zero impact. Now, there is a statement, Denis seems to be taken for granted that government-owned banks are less efficient and profitable. So, despite this fact, Denis finds that these banks, provide some useful service during the crisis. Well, the most recent empirical research in Russia doesn't suggest that state-owned banks are necessarily, by definition, less efficient. Non papers. This one, of course, Karas, Schurs, and Whale. We have rechecked a number of things with Mikhail jointly, and we came to a similar conclusion. You should not take for granted that the state-owned banks in Russia are less efficient. Just empirics don't really work that way. Now my last slide. Well, here we come to the essence. This is not the first paper on the subject that I read. I've read this paper by Fungachova, Herral, and Vale, and I find the finding of this paper to be pretty much in line with what Denis says. But see, they find that the bank ownership in Russia, and it was written on Russia very specifically, affected credit supply during financial crisis and so on. So the question is, what exactly does this paper add to the paper by Fungaccio, Harrell, and Whale. Is actually, if it develops something new, but I did not exactly identify what is the new angle or the new approach or something. It talks about the same thing and comes basically to the same conclusion. To my mind, the two research questions in Denis' papers overlap. One is now, what was the lending performance of state-controlled banks? And another one, what was the effect of government intervention in response to the financial crisis? Well, these are two rather separate questions, but they are in one paper, so like two in one, like head and shoulders, yeah? Two in one. But you can look at these things separately, and in some way, essentially, you're maybe talking about the same thing. There may be indigeneity, because the government intervened mostly through the state-owned banks. And not only in terms of liquidity support, but also in terms of recapitalization. So essentially, you're talking about the same phenomenon. Yeah, there may be double count in this. If I put it bluntly and in short, there may be double count in what you do. So I wonder why you need two purposes. Would it not be enough for you to see whether state-owned banks have contributed positively and have improved the situation and have dealt with the effect of the liquidity crunch and something? Because capitalization, as a matter of fact, once again, I would rather like to see it as an explanatory variable. Once again, like Professor Bonin did, he showed that better capitalized banks have reacted this ways, and less capitalized banks have reacted that way. All right, that's more or less what essentially I was interested to see. Well, I think that's it essentially. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the questions? Yeah, he's preparing to present, so you may ask. Yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, I have a comment and a normative issue. First comment is, I think when you exaggerated the role of the bailouts, and certainly in the U.S. banking sector, and that was not. You couldn't characterize it as nationalization. You could characterize it as a temporary support in which the contract was written so that those shares were temporarily placed somewhere in a particular type of financial instrument. And I don't know anybody at Citicorp who would think that they're nationalized banks. So I think you have to be a little bit careful on that. The other thing that I had a question, but your discussant asked it about fully state-owned banks, so I won't ask that. But I think this is a nice contribution to the literature that suggests state ownership has a multiple objective factor function, and when we overlook that fact and focus on things that private banks have as in their objective function, we're missing something. Usually the argument is informative, but here it's, and Bob and Soleil's paper, as you pointed out, also in Latin America found this result with state-owned banks. What concerned me about their result, and concerns me to some extent about your result too, although your discussant has made me feel a little bit better about it in this country, is from a normative point of view, is supporting misallocated lending a good thing? If state-owned banks actually misallocate capital, the fact that they continue to misallocate capital through the crisis, should we applaud that or not?
Other comments? Questions? So you may respond to some comments.
Okay, well, I probably would start just responding to Andrei. So, yeah, it's about the capitalization. You're absolutely right. It probably has nothing to do with the first research question about the credit growth, but in a sense, many studies use capitalization as the proxy for risk-taking of banks. And that also relates to the misallocation part of the story. So I was wondering if this increased lending causes some sort of increased risk-taking. So I didn't really want to call it risk-taking because probably then I would have to use like many other risk-taking measures than just the capital ratio. But just to see if there's any influence on the capital ratio, I thought it would be also interesting. So, and in fact, yes, I used in the other regression, the first regression, I used the capital ratio as the control variable, so it's in there. Yeah. And then about the Fungansova papers, Fungansova and others papers, they actually use completely different framework and completely different type of the analysis in their paper. So what I'm just using the panel regression with fixed effects, and then as far as I know, in their paper they use a completely different, contention phase or something like that. I don't know exactly this. Just completely different approach that they're using. So in a sense, it's not really the same calculations what they did, but it's just the same story, but from the other side. Yeah.
I have a very practical question. So I'm just looking at summary stats. And so let me read out these numbers. 2008, 8%, 7.9% growth, lending growth of state banks. 2009, 11.5. 2010, 11.18%. So it seems to me that the state banks just are unaffected by the crisis in terms of lending growth, possibly because of bailouts until they have government support. While the private banks have seen minus 1%, minus 4 or 5%, and now plus 24% already in 2010.
Yeah.
So in the graphs, you don't see it because the graphs have this huge number at the beginning. If you look at the details, you basically see, so that one interpretation is that private banks are hit by the shock and they recover, and state banks just don't move. They just grind on. And so yeah, this is essentially not the government effect. It will show like this in the regression. But yeah, it's a private bank effect. The government banks just don't budge. And the private banks, they crash and they recover, and that gives you the coefficients. If you get actually the raw data, the action is in the private banks, not in the government banks. Well, you write a paper about action in the government banks. So I'm not sure what I want to say, but there's an issue there about what eyeballing the data tells you in terms of storyline,
Yeah.
and what your regressions tell you in terms of storyline.
Yeah, I see your point, but the thing is that during the crisis, everybody crushed the groups. Everybody, even the state-owned banks, they crushed as well. There was a huge decline. But the story from this paper comes from this cyclical behavior of the state-owned banks. So that's why you see the stable rate of growth of loans in the most kind of severe crisis years. So yes, it was constantly.
It was constant.
Yeah. While if you look at the private banks, it was like huge drop, just a drop. But then when the market started to recover, so I'm not sure if it's the private banks recovered like that fast, 24% in 2010. The state-owned banks actually decreased a little bit after the crisis years. So in a sense, a really good example of the cultural cyclical behavior of these two types.
But I don't see the decrease in fact. So if you look at the figure we also showed, even in 2011, state banks also go up. There's no decrease. So the state bank dropped in 2008, and then they grow but very smoothly. It's like 7, it's 11, then it's like something like 10.
But if you look at the graph, then I think the graph is a little bit more accurate because it covers many years.
Oh,
so you can skip the stats, there are only 3 years that
okay.
Yes. Yeah. So if you look at the graph at the end, there is a quite obvious contrast cyclical movement.
Make a short comment. Well, looking at this lending data could be generally misleading. I remember in the US during this crisis period there was some working paper which found, I think some economists from Minnesota Fed found that during the crisis lending that didn't go down or even increased, and it was very sort of sensational. But then some other people looked at it more carefully, and basically they say that banks refinance already existing loans, the evergreen loans, which are maturing but non-performing, but they still continue them on their books. And companies draw down the credit lines during the crisis. But if you look at new loans origination, then there was a huge drop. And unfortunately, with this data, you cannot say that. So you cannot see new loans origination. But at least I think the great idea would be that, well, in Russia, I think this evergreening was actually because banks could use it as a sort of condition to get state funding. because they get state funding because they evergreen, because they continue lending. And you could see maybe who get more bailout, something like this.
I have a question, the same line, I wrote it down, I was going to read about it later, but so to what extent is the counter-cyclical lending of the state banks actually subsidy to state firms? I remember the Rusal case, right?
Yeah.
The Rusal case, they were bankrupt, they couldn't refinance their bonds, and then the government said, National Bank gave Rusal a massive loan. But massive loan is in the data. Is it counter-cyclical lending, or is it just a subsidy to Rusal in a complicated way? And I think there's actually some data on these subsidies. Much of it was publicized. If you get it out of your data, what do you find? So, or at least, it's interesting to consider, I think.
That's a really good point. I mean, it would be nice to see where these loans from the state banks go.
Yeah.
This is not nice, but unfortunately, I just didn't have an access to such kind of data. And I'm not sure where to get it. Probably you guys have it, but
No.
Yeah.
You would like to have it too.
Yeah, so it would be really nice to have it. Another question is about the whole thing about the growth of loans in general. I agree, but from the perspective that at what cost it comes with state support. So is it really something that beneficial for the economy that they're increasing lending, or the cost at which it comes, it really outweighs the whole thing? So from that perspective, it would be also interesting to examine.
May I respond briefly to the point of I think that during the crisis, the variation in the capital adequacy ratio does not really reflect the risk taking, but it rather reflects the degree to which the regulators prepare to tolerate the need regressive. During the crisis, the central bank actually not only tolerated but provided banks with risk report. Therefore, the dynamics of this indicator in the year 2005 doesn't actually very long term. So I don't see why we really want to look into it. Right? And very quickly, I wonder whether this is coming back to cover. Because the banks all covers it, Russian banking statistics does not. However, if you mention loan to Rusal, then it's not there.
National Bank would not be in the
VEB, the development bank. Okay? Because I think it was there to provide it to Rusal. That is the case, that is not there.
Yeah, then I think it's not
Because that is not covered by the regular banking statistics.
It's not the bank from.
It's not the bank.
Not really.
It is a bank.
It is a bank, because that
It's not covered by the central
Formally
bank.
so.
I think not. It isn't.
It's not the
Then
bank
more
from.
And central bank has a loan portfolio which is equal to 10% of the regular banking system.
Yeah.
Do not underestimate it. I'm now collecting a row for DEP. Project lending, apart from there are other functions like external debt management, like pension funds, asset management, I mean, only lending operation, it is a bank. It has always been a bank. It has corporate banking, it has trade finance, all of stuff. It is a bank. But it's not covered.
It's a bank, but it isn't.
It's a financial institution.
Yes, but it is.
As far as you know, it's completely different
Yes.
regulation.
Thank you very much.
It's
Let's
a
move on.
management conservation.
Our next